as everybody's coming into the Zoom room. So two speakers again. We have first coming up is Erika Scott. She is going to talk to us about the logging industry stresses and how it impacts our mental health. And then when Erika is finished, we're going to have Rebecca Weston come on to talk about something that we've never had here on the AgriStress Network, and that's how climate change is affecting our mental health. So I am going to go ahead and stop sharing so that Erika has plenty of time to go ahead and give her presentation. And thank you for everybody entering into the chat. You never know who you're going to connect with or need to connect with until you see their title.
Very good. All right. Well, I guess without further ado, we'll get started. Can you see full screen on your end?
Yep, everything looks
perfect.
Just perfect.
Excellent. Yeah, well, thanks for having both of us today. Really glad to be here together. And I'm really curious to see how actually these two topics sort of flow into one another, because there's certainly some connections, I think. So for the sake of time and kind of what we'll get through, I'm hoping to present a little bit in our background in logger health and safety here at the center. Look a little bit to what the industry looks like in the Northeast and how it's changed over time, and what those changes really mean for the logging industry. And then lastly, look at how stress is contributing to some additional health challenges that we've uncovered, and end with future directions on how we hope to address some of these challenges. So a little bit about us. I think some may be familiar, but for those that are not, we are the Northeast Center for Occupational Health and Safety. We are one of the 12 extramurally funded NIOSH Ag, Fishing, Forestry research centers. And you can see in the circle there, we work from Maine all the way down through West Virginia and are based in beautiful Cooperstown, New York, home of the Baseball Hall of Fame. So a little bit just to kind of contextualize background, I've been with the center for 15 years and have a focus in occupational health and safety and industrial hygiene. And my master's work actually involved looking at tree work fatalities. So those included arborists and tree climbers, et cetera. And my doctoral work included focusing on improving injury surveillance in agriculture and forestry in particular. We had a pretty large study here, which I'll talk a little bit about in the next few slides, up in Maine, and have been involved with logger safety trainings and outreach since actually the time I was in graduate school. And have even gotten to get my hands on a chainsaw once in a while, as shown in that picture, although that is not my day job, thankfully. We leave it to the actual professionals. So the Maine Logger Health and Safety Study is a great was a long-standing study that we had that was part of our Northeast Center overall center. And we had 6 years to kind of work on multiple components. Okay, it's acting on its own now. Hold on one second, guys, sorry. Okay, back with the program. Looking at really injury surveillance, but we also had the ability to add on some other sub-projects as time went on, and it was really informed by what was going on at that time. So it was right in the middle of COVID, and we had some other, okay, must be on an auto timer. Anywho, we'll move on for the sake of time. So we had that study. In addition, we recently completed a series of key informant interviews with loggers across New York, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania to really try to get the sense of what's happening in the other regions of our neck of the woods, pun intended. So Northeast logging tends to differ. I've had the fortune to be in some woodlots in Virginia and in the Pacific Northwest, where, and especially places like the Deep South, have a lot of pine plantations, a lot of planting, and very organized, tidy ways of dealing with the woods. Harder in some areas than others, but we have a lot of hardwoods in the Northeast. We have fewer plantations, and then fewer planting crews that are out. So a lot of our forests, and especially for the loggers that we've worked with, have been in forests where natural regeneration is going. The loggers are really with taking out trees with the mind of how can you enhance the forest for the future and what's going to be naturally regenerated. The industry has been mechanizing, of course, throughout the more recent decades, and that's at varying rates throughout the Northeast. And that's pushed from several factors. So labor shortages, efficiency of work, safety for sure, and then competition among loggers. And I think that's driven especially by the wood market and mill closures and sort of where are they going to be able to send their products and still make money. So I want to give an example of, the theme of this talk really relates to stress and mental health and give some factors that may play in. So I'm going to show, hopefully it's a short video clip will work just to kind of set the stage.
Paper mill in Jay, Maine, that was the site of this explosion back in 2020, is closing for good. The mill lost its ability to produce pulp after the blast, but continued to operate a pair of paper machines. The closure will leave 230 people out of work. The mill is set to shut down early next year.
So that clip, first of all, I have to say it was amazing that no one was killed in that paper, in that explosion. The video was taken off some of the log trucks that were waiting to go into the mill. And as I mentioned, that mill was closing. They couldn't keep it open. The jobs that were lost with people that worked at the mill. But I have to say, there was an enormous amount of loggers that were enrolled in our research study that transported to that mill in Jay. And we had asked, and that happened not even a month after COVID lockdown. So, some of the quotes on the side were directly from our loggers as part of our survey, asking what impact did this have on the industry. And you can see that, has broken the last link in one of the solid chains. The logging industry, every woodlot is producing pulp, and if you have nowhere to put it, you don't have any more room for those costs. And then saying that the local markets were already questionable, and we haven't been able to sell a single load of pine pulp since the explosion. And not only for this explosion in Jay, but there have been other mill closures, and that means that loggers and they're trucking their product much, much farther, which increases the costs and stress certainly to the industry as well. So over time, there's certainly been changing woods ownership and structure. So there's a lot of timber investment management organizations, which are these huge holdings that have sort of organizational buyers. We've seen more foreign investment come in terms of owning mills and owning land. And many of the loggers that we work with are still independent contractors, but they may be working with a larger landowner or bidding on projects around. And at least from what we've heard from the loggers that we've had contact with, is they feel like they're kind of being squeezed by the rest of the forest products value chain. So everyone is trying to, of course, make money throughout the process, which is the point. But the loggers at the initial outset feel as though they are, kind of the last link there. So as I mentioned that logging has changed across Northeast. So we still see some conventional logging, which you'd imagine chainsaw in hand, you have a skidder, you're physically cutting down trees. It's a very laborious process, of course, and that is really driving some of the fatalities and serious injuries in terms of falling trees, chainsaw kickbacks, etc. As we go to mechanization, we have operators in an enclosed cab, and the type of work has drastically changed. So it's really sedentary work, with the exception of getting out maybe to, do some repairs or changing a chain on the processor head, for example. We still see hazards in terms of slips, trips, and falls off of equipment and musculoskeletal injuries, but it really is quite different. And for our study, we had 3/4 were mechanized loggers up in Maine and enrolled in our study, and 1/4 were still conventional loggers. There's still some places that it's easy, well, easier shouldn't be the right word, but it's better to use chainsaws depending on the slope, depending on the size of the trees. If they're incredibly large, sometimes it's hard for certain types of equipment to process those. But even with those slopes and sort of more dangerous areas, mechanized logging operations are changing, even to tether equipment, for example, down slopes, or how can you further remove the operator from the hazard zones. So with this change, we've seen increased safety. It's true. There's fewer fatalities, although there still are fatalities. And just for context, logging and commercial fishing still change place back and forth year to year as the most fatal occupation in the United States. We see climate controlled cabs, which is a benefit, decreased movement and less calories burned through work, and as mentioned by the loggers themselves, increasing waistlines and seat time, not only in the
Saved her nothing on mine.
equipment itself,
It would
but
be an
also
email.
for their commutes. And we've also seen an increasing use of technology in this industry as well. So the computerized systems within processors and feller bunchers, for example, is quite complex. And these guys are really incredibly adept actually at using this, but that was not part of their work life, 10, 20, 30 years ago. And then I would say the increasing pace of work has led to some increasing mental fatigue. And I'm actually going to let the loggers say this better than I could. And you'll hear a little bit about a few of the loggers that we've worked with. So I'm going to skip ahead a bit in this video just to get to the critical part here.
Controls to help us manage those in the field.
It's just really changed from a physically demanding job to more of a mentally demanding job.
I used to run processor. And finally, after a number of years of doing that, well, both processor and forwarder, I just finally asked them, can I just stop being so stressed? Because you make a mistake with that thing, and it's 80 feet tall, and it can come back and bite you.
Say they've got 7 to 10 decisions to make in a half a second, and they make one of those decisions wrong. We're not worried about if they cut the wood right or not. We're worried about if they get hurt, and things can go wrong in a hurry with machines that big and powerful.
Conventional logging is a dangerous profession because there's a lot of uncontrolled elements that you try to control them. The areas that you have to pay attention the most are, when you're felling the tree. That's the place where if you become injured, it's going to be from a broken top from another tree, a top coming out of that tree, the tree kicking back, hitting you. A lot of people survive cuts and, that typical slip and fall that comes along with working in the woods. Not many people walk away from being hit by a tree or a top or a tree that kicks back and strikes them. And that's usually when they find someone dead in the woods.
So I wanted to just really have, in their own words, explain some of as you can imagine, it was, even Jeff used the word, it caused me so much stress running the processor that I wanted to do something that was less mentally taxing, even though what he does is still mentally taxing. And then the stress, so as you saw for the conventional logger, he works alone in the woods. He is a sole operator, and he is constantly paying attention to his surroundings, to exactly what he's doing. And there is a level of sort of stress and underlying awareness that is part of his job day to day. So just to kind of other things that are causing some concern. In our study, loggers in Maine reported they were 8 times more likely to report having Lyme disease than the average Mainer. That has brought a host of other health concerns and lingering health effects that has impacted their ability to work. Other environmental concerns and the ticks have expanded, but brown-tailed moth caterpillar habitat is expanding also. And they have a very poisonous or like venomous when you come into contact with them, and even when they're dead, they still cause a skin reaction. So there are certain things that may play into sort of climate change and thinking about expanding, seasons for things or weather related or, critters expanding their territory. I think in terms of stresses too, given the way that logging has changed, we've seen a change in just basic daily activities taking a back burner because your time is spent on work and getting to work and prioritizing that. So for many, we took a deep dive into diet and saw that, it's not that they don't know how to eat healthfully, but it's really the time and the effort in order to do so that is, the critical barrier given everything else going on in their lives. This is one of our favorite photos. Thought it was incredibly clever to illustrate the heartburn that comes with getting your lunch at the gas station. So, there was also, for those that didn't feel that they could eat really well, kind of feelings of regret because they know better, so to speak. I think there was a lot of like, oh, I should do this. It's kind of like, the shoulding, but within the realities of their day to day. So they were also feeling some negative feelings towards those that had to adhere to certain calorie restricted diets because they became operators. Their doctors said, hey, you got to lose a few pounds. Their kids are eating whatever they want. And they're like, well, I can't have the fun stuff. I think a lot of us can relate to that as well. We did have a few loggers that had homesteads and had grew their own vegetables or had their own livestock. And there was certainly a value in the home prepared or sort of you know, feeling that that was better for them, but they were fewer and farther between, I'll say. We saw really excessive hypertension among loggers, and especially those that are equipment operators now, and that was statistically significantly greater than other men in Maine of their same age and demographics. And we've seen increasing obesity trends as well. So again, I think, they harken back to often their dads, their granddads, their great grandfathers were loggers, and, the work that they're doing is at a faster pace and just in a very different environment than they had before. As we mentioned, the cardiovascular findings, hypertension there. So almost half of those that were screened were in stage 2 hypertension. And the mouths you see, those are Mallampati scores. That's how open your airway is. We also saw some indication of, increasing scores for Mallampati, so more closed airway. And taken all together, these point to issues like sleep apnea. So also, if you're not getting a good night's sleep, you're under stress, you're under pressure, sort of a boiling point. And then lastly, which kind of ties this all together, is that we found that there was a serious lack of health insurance among this occupational group. Now, there are programs, of course, Maine just launched Cover Me, which is sort of their state health exchange. Some of these guys are working for larger companies and some offer health insurance. Some have health insurance through their spouses, for example. But at least in our study, 1 in 4 participants did not have any type of health insurance. And we would imagine that those that participated in the health study may be more interested in their health. So we're deducing that it's likely that that rate is actually higher among the general population of loggers. And we had a hazard ratio of 1.51. So over a 50%, increased hazard ratio of the link between traumatic injury rates and having no health insurance. So I'm not even talking about workers' comp, but just merely having just your basic healthcare taken care of. So in nearly half of the loggers in our study had reported injuries and sometimes multiple injuries. I mentioned that this study kind of went over this course of the pandemic. We asked loggers about that as well. So we had nearly half of loggers reply that they had job loss of workers, loss of market for woods, which plays back to that J. Maine explosion, increased quotas. So again, more pressure on them to be working longer hours, and real significant changes in, whether they had to be homeschooling or taking care of children or grandchildren, for example. And many had to switch up what they were doing just to make ends meet. So going to tree work, so maybe some arborist work, firewood, trucking, anything that they could kind of scrap together to make up for that lost income. And, there are some lingering effects, I think, of that. Obviously, things have changed for the better, but there are still some lingering effects of those mill closures. So we had asked if there were behavioral changes during this time, and this was pretty telling too. So in your community, we asked, do people seem more tense, restless, or nervous or anxious? 64% of the cohort said yes. 55% remarked that folks seemed more down, depressed, and hopeless. And I should mention for context that these questions, we surveyed loggers across the whole Northeast region. So this is Maine all the way down to West Virginia. Increasing use of illegal drugs or drinking, and it saw a slight increase in reporting for verbally or physically abusive to members of households. And then the last two, I pulled out a few quotes from our free text responses, but noting at that time that it was incredibly stressful and hard for them, both owners and employees, whether they could actually continue their business or continue to employ their employees. And then saying that in my line of work, there are always financial struggles, and COVID just put them over the edge. And literally, putting food on the table is a constant literal struggle. So lastly, I'll kind of wrap up a little bit with our interviews that we've conducted more recently, and these were in New York, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. So stress from the timber market instability came up very frequently in our key informant interviews. And again, this is sort of where loggers feel as though they don't get a lot of say in what the pricing structures are going to be. This is not uncommonly heard, I think, from farmers also, especially with milk prices or other commodity prices. We see the same thing in logging. Stress from high equipment costs, as we mentioned, with fewer workers and the need to kind of get the work done, they're often needing to purchase equipment, which is upwards of $1 million or more, and financing that. And having an $8,000 or $10,000 monthly payment hanging over your head every month was brought up very frequently. So that's, in order to stay in this business, there are some significant upfront costs and ongoing costs. We see continued fatigue because the more mechanized we've gone, sometimes the woodlots are farther. We saw in our main study that the average commute one way for mechanized loggers in our region was over 70 minutes. That some of the guys were driving up to 2 hours one direction to get to the woodlot and working sometimes up to 14 hours a day. So you can imagine that leaves little time to come home to do anything except, grab something from the gas station and fall asleep and just get up again at 2 o'clock in the morning and repeat it all over again. The hours for conventional are slightly less, and I think that has to do somewhat with even just daylight. A lot of the logging equipment has floodlights on it, so they can operate in 2 shifts. They could do overnights and whatnot, so they have a lot more flexibility in when they can get wood out. There was some concern for lack of required training and sort of the professionalism for the industry and wanting to maintain that, and I think that was I think the stress from there is making sure that they want the layperson's opinion that they're professional and they know what they're doing, and that's not always the case. So then lastly, just to finish up here, I think there are some challenges in addressing both stress and just general health and safety overall. There are some social norms of the industry, and I think it's an incredibly male-dominated industry still. And these companies have started, sometimes they're legacy companies, sometimes they're new, but, they pride themselves, as they should, on, being industrious, working really hard, and being kind of independent. So I think there's some challenges in kind of asking us to look at health and safety in a way that fits within those social norms. There are limited financial factors, I think, in general, not only for the logging industry, but for studying health and safety in the logging industry. So we're kind of looking to opportunities for rural health and how we can make sure that this occupational group is included. They're very geographically dispersed, makes it hard. You spend a lot of time in the car going to find these guys. And sometimes there are limited health and medical resources in these rural areas where they live. And just overall, the work organization is not always conducive to wellness because there's all of these other pressures. Again, not of their own choosing sometimes, but there are many other pressures. So with that, our focus right now is on trying to address the healthcare issue, because we see that as sort of the root of a lot of these issues, and have put in several applications for CDS funding or for other funding sources to have a logger health navigator program for the state of Maine. And then lastly, I'll just say that this work is not possible without a team. We have a fantastic team. This is not even everyone. We've used local folks in Maine when we've worked up there, but this is the primary crew. And there are some publications from the various aspects of the study that touch on some of the things I talked today. So these I can make available to folks after the webinar today if you'd like. And I'll just say thank you so much for your time and joining today.
Thank you, Erika. Yeah, and I think everybody would love for you to forward that information on. As I'm watching this, my husband loves these kind of documentaries, and kind of like fishing. After you get done presenting, I'm thinking, why does anybody want to have this career? Because it just sounds awful.
And they'll tell you that the saw is sawdust runs in their blood. They love it.
Yeah,
they love working in the
what I'm
woods.
thinking.
There's a lot of positives too. They love the peace of working in the woods, and there's a lot of good things. So I shouldn't just say it's all bad. Certainly not.
No, nothing, none of it's all bad. But while I'm watching this, like I like on the documentaries, I saw that emotions could get high in a very short amount of time, like very quickly, because it is so dangerous. And you're always on, like you can't just drop down for a moment, because that's when a mistake could happen. Are you finding that loggers are continuing to stay in this career lifelong, or are you seeing a trend that they're like, you know what, this is just too much, I'm going to go try to find something less stressful?
I think a lot of them stick it out. I'll be completely honest that we see a lot of guys that are in their 60s, 70s that are still doing this type of work. And it's there's of course been a few, I'm sure, that have changed to a less stressful occupation, or maybe doing something other that's equipment operation in their rural communities. But I think by and large, there is a reason they stay in it, and there are some of those positive aspects about they don't want to work in an office, they don't want to, push paper around. They appreciate the freedom and they appreciate the beauty of the woods and contributing to the economy in that way. And it's a legacy. I think they also love living in the areas that they do, which may be rural, but are also incredibly beautiful. Um, so, so yeah, I think the hardest thing is getting the young guys to come into the industry to replace those that have retired, I think.
Yeah, I think you just described the entire agriculture community in a whole.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, it's very
we do
similar.
it because it's just in our blood.
Yep.
I did have another question. Like you said, sometimes the commute is up to 2 hours. Do all loggers go home every night, or are they kind of isolated for a certain amount of time with just their crew?
Yeah, so that is not something else that's changed over decades. I think back in their great grandfather's era, there used to be logging camps set up in the North 40, and they'd have a cookout there, and they would come back to the camp and go out back in the morning. By and large, most of them come home at night. There are still a few crews, and I'm thinking mostly of Maine as my context right now from that larger study. There are a few crews that work up, in areas north of the Golden Road, Millinocket, that may still have a camp that they're staying up there, but for the most part, they're coming home.
Okay. Okay. We had a couple things in the chat. Yes, they would definitely like the link to the study, if we could send that. And if you could put that in the chat, and then I'll copy it and we'll make sure it goes out in our email as well. Catherine said, my partner is a logger and she very much appreciated this from a personal as well as a professional lens.
Excellent. And yeah, I'm happy to distribute, and that's great to hear. And I think, like the farmers that many of us work with, but we feel so lucky to work with these loggers, and they are the nicest and most just appreciative once you get to know them. And they're like, why are you here? Once they realize you're here for them, it's been nothing but a fabulous experience.
So with the
appreciate what they
long
do for
hours
us.
that yeah, with the long hours that they have to sustain, how do they even get mental health help, or do they at all?
I don't think it's a real common thing, to be
Yeah.
completely honest. I think some of them have networks with their crew and their buddies that, are very valuable. And, I think even like it was shown in the video, Jeff has worked with Tom for a long time. And I think that when you have the guys are often close knit, they've worked together for a long time together. And I think, they do look out for one another. So.
Oh, you went silent.
Sorry, he let them change up what he's doing. But I think that is a way to explore, how, maybe peer support for this group, and kind of what's come up just naturally, but something still more to explore for sure.
Definitely. And Carol definitely wants, she couldn't screenshot your QR codes. So if you'll put, your name, contact information, those, and then where they can get the link to the study in the chat. I'll make sure they get all those in the email as well. So does anybody have any questions for Erika? You can unmute, or you can put it in the chat if you would like. Okay. All right, Erika, thank you so much for presenting today. And logging is not something that's huge in my area. We have a couple sawmills, but nothing like what you guys have up there. So it's always very interesting to, I guess, get in your world a little bit, because we get so stuck in ours that like we all have stresses. So I appreciate you coming to share with us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Right. So next up, we are going to have Rebecca Weston present something completely different than we've ever had on the AgriStress Network meeting before. She's going to talk about how climate change is affecting mental health. And I have never heard anyone use those words together in my life. Maybe you have, but I've never heard anybody say, yeah, the climate change is really messing me up. It's always something else. But I think not understanding that climate change may be related to whatever they're thinking is causing them frustration. So Rebecca, I will let you go ahead and share, and we'll go ahead and let you get started.
All right, thank you so much. I will head over to the share screen and I'll take a moment to do that, and I'll see you in just a second here.
Okay.
All right, whoops. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yep, everything looks good.
All righty. So I did want to say thank you so much. I've been learning more and more about this organization and learning more and more about the variety of different sort of mental health challenges that are so linked to not only agriculture, to the economy, to weather systems, to the unpredictability of all of this. And I'm just learning so much. And my own background, very, very briefly, is that I'm from Iowa. I am from a rural state. And then I spent a huge part of my life in Montana that I have all sorts of deep connections with. And so I come also from New York. And so I have a kind of wide variety of ways in which I think about mental health, the language of mental health, who wants to talk about mental health, who doesn't want to talk about mental health. So I'd be really interested afterwards, sort of in the chat, for ideas about how we talk about these things, because I think it's so varied all over the country. So I certainly don't want to come across feeling like I have all the answers about how we address these things, the language we use. So anything that people want to suggest, I would be so interested in hearing people's impressions. So I want to say thanks for inviting me here. And indeed, I am going to be talking about the relationship between climate change and mental health, and what we talk about in terms of climate distress. Oftentimes, the language of what's called eco-anxiety or eco-distress is kind of dismissed in a lot of different places as being kind of urban, as being primarily for young people. It's sort of connected to being kind of woke. There's a whole sort of way in which that kind of language, if people have heard a bit about it, is really not seen as applicable to them. And it's seen sort of as something other and kind of weak or pathetic. And I want to just talk a little bit about how that's really not sort of how we think about climate and its relationship to mental health. Oops, somehow this isn't. But I first am going to start with how, because climate change has become so hyper politicized in our discourse, in the political campaigns and around the country, I really, really want to make it clear that, at least from our perspective, that farming is not a political party, land is not a political party, production of food is not connected to a political party. It is about being human, relating to the land, relating to the world, mutual aid, providing for each other, and really sustaining ourselves. And I think the way in which it's gotten so polarized has been incredibly damaging for people who are wanting to sort of talk a little bit more about what the impact is about these changing climate structures and policies and how it can impact them. And that's going to be part of what I talk about in terms of why it's so difficult to talk about climate change. Oops. So I want to begin by emphasizing that despite what people sometimes think, the majority of American people are actually worried about global warming. And that's not necessarily party identified, actually, and that over 62% of most Americans are concerned about it. They have a great deal of worry or moderate levels of worry, but those numbers are only increasing. So from 2015 all the way up to now, the numbers have steadily increased about who in the United States cares and worries about climate change and how it's impacting them. So again, contrary to our belief that it's not actually a ubiquitous feeling, huge numbers of people do think about climate change, and they are worried about how it's going to impact them, either very worried or somewhat worried. And the language of that, I really appreciated Erika's sort of using of the quotations in her videos, because oftentimes what we look at as data or suicide rates or depression rates or anxiety rates, and we use different language that really feels very disconnected to how people are going through their days. And so I wanted to, I've done a lot of reading about, whoops, I keep on doing this somehow. I'm so sorry. Have you guys missed? Something's happened to my, This is not, I'm really sorry, you guys. My computer seems to be funky. Really apologize about that. So I've done sort of lots of different reading about sort of how climate change actually feels for people. And I was really struck in one article I read about someone saying that they feel more like a professional gambler than they do feel like a farmer, that they are constantly having to weigh the odds. Is it worth spending huge amounts of money? Is it worth trying to start another crop? Is it worth trying it for another year? Is it worth training their children to be farmers? Is it worth investing in that psychological energy? How do you measure that when it's weighed against your own history, your own identity, your own connection to the land? And always feeling as if they are having to roll the dice. When is it going to work? When is it not? And feeling very much out of control of those situations, which is also a huge psychological challenge to feel so out of control of so many of the different factors that are part of their work. Another person wrote about how farmers spend so much time alone working on the farm. There's a lot of time to think and get into some deep, dark places. And so, yes, in addition to the sort of the sort of independence and the sense of connection to the land is also the isolation of people working day in and day out on the farm when they're not actually able to talk with other people and can ruminate a great deal about the effects of drought, about the effects of heat waves, about the effects of fire if you're in a state where there's more fires and that's increasing all over the country. And what happens in those places, especially if they're on the land so long and so many hours, is that it can become incredibly isolating and suffocating, where you go into deep, dark places, as people say. And then another person who wrote, "We count our blessings every day." And Erika spoke about those blessings, what it means to work in these fields. And yet to know that the work we've done, the lengths we've gone to collect and store water, is simply not enough to shield us from climate collapse, is both heartbreaking and terrifying. We are left with the difficult question of where to call home. And I think that that goes to so many different factors, in addition to it being very concrete. Where will we live? Who do we live among? How will we make a living? It also addresses far deeper psychological and emotional questions about what is home? Who is home? Where is home? How can I possibly make myself feel at home in a place that is changing, but I can't imagine living anywhere else? And those are huge questions that come up for a lot of people, even if they don't talk about it as eco-distress or eco-anxiety, which is the sort of popular media conception of that. The problem, though, is that even though huge numbers of people do worry about climate change, and even though it is impacting people so deeply in the deep, dark places, people rarely talk about it. What this indicates is that 65% of the people, the same number of people who are so concerned, 65% of the people don't talk about it, that it's silent, it stays inward. And and I'll talk a little bit about all the numbers of reasons why people might not talk about it. But the consequence of that is that people don't actually understand that they're not alone. So why is it so hard to talk about climate distress? For one, and I think Erika mentioned this as well, is that there's the social sort of fabric often doesn't reward talking about mental health, particularly in these areas. And there's a stigma in general around mental health. As one person wrote, it's not like cancer where people can organize food shelters or food campaigns for families and rally around medical care. It's not like that. It feels much more isolating. It feels much more stigmatizing. It's much harder to talk about, and you feel much more alone. I also think that climate change and climate distress arouses a lot of shame in people. And again, I think that Erika mentioned this as well, is that in these communities, there is a real feeling of overcoming hardship, of being able to work resiliently and very long hours. That's part of a point of pride, sort of individually being able to hack it, all of those other kinds of feelings. And so when you are confronted with a climate-related distress that is out of your control, it challenges one's own sense of identity, one's sense of shame, one's sense of capacity. It makes people wonder, who am I? What legacy am I failing if I can't do this, but my family could, my other generations could? What's wrong with me? Those are very, very deep feelings that make it very hard to talk about. And I think finally, and this does tap onto some sort of political questions, is that the discourse around climate change often comes across as very blaming. It comes across as lack of respect for so many people who do this work, a sense of contempt about sort of particularly for ranchers and about meat and about sort of the whole agricultural sector often doesn't get included and talked about and welcomed into the discussion. And so oftentimes when climate solutions are proposed, it ends up feeling very, very sort of separate from the experience that people have in terms of trying to both respect the land and make a living. And all of those things conspire to a place where they don't want to talk about it. It's too hard to talk about it. And what ends up happening in that silence when people don't talk about it and when they feel it is that 80 or 90% of people think that other people don't care about it and think that they're the only ones. And it creates a self-silencing process that people are feeling it, but not talking about it, feeling like they're only one. So they again don't want to talk about it. And it creates more and more and more feelings of isolation. This is what often people end up feeling, that it's not something we can talk about. Oftentimes, when people don't talk about things that's making them feel so overwhelmed or so helpless, popular culture tends to make it seem as if people are just apathetic, that they just don't care, when actually it's quite the opposite, that people are feeling such deep feelings, so many feelings that are hard to access and talk about with other people, that they shut down, they turn away, and it looks like apathy when it's actually feelings that can't get processed, can't get named, and certainly can't get solved. So as a mental health clinician, what I think a lot about is how do we create spaces for people to talk about things that are incredibly scary to talk about, that feel very threatening. And I'm going to use a concept that comes in some ways from parenting therapy, discourses about sort of regulating ourselves when we're hyper anxious. How do we address our sorts of deep anger at certain situations? I think, Carrie, you had asked sort of, do people have access to mental health care? What do they do when emotions flare very, very quickly? How do we regulate ourselves? And oftentimes, and I suspect this is true in anybody's family or even in ourselves, we don't always know how to manage these huge feelings that surge and come up. And what I want to talk about is a concept called the window of tolerance. And what this means is that every single person has within themselves a bandwidth where they can know what they're feeling, they can even talk about what they're feeling, and they can ask for help about what they need. That's a pretty important triple combination: to know what you're feeling, to be able to talk about it, and therefore to be able to receive and get the help you need. Unfortunately, huge numbers of people, we can probably raise our own hands, think of people in our families who don't have capacities within those different ways. And when we are out of our window of tolerance, of big, deep feelings, people do any number of things. One of them is they flip out. They get angry, they get rageful, they do violence, they destroy things, they shout, they are literally outside their window and get kind of hyper out of control. And again, this is very, very common, and it's usually and almost mostly a sign of being utterly overwhelmed by the feelings that they're having internally and struggling to find a way to manage it. The other option people often do is they check out. They become numb. They fall asleep a lot more. They doom scroll. They drink. They do drugs. They take long periods of isolation, go inwards. And people often do both. Unfortunately, we're not all such organized human beings that we don't do one or the other at different times. So people often go back and forth in trying to manage such profound feelings. And so what we're trying to offer from the Climate Psychology Alliance is a way to increase people's windows of tolerance, to be able to talk about the issues that are so threatening to talk about. And from that place, get some relief, some sense of community, some sense of reduction in isolation. There's a climate scientist and researcher communicator named Katharine Hayhoe, who is a pretty extraordinary communicator. She comes from Texas. She's an evangelist, and she also happens to be one of the best people who knows how to reach different people around issues of climate, avoiding the hyperpolitization, addressing people with the values that they care most about, and being exceedingly non-judgmental and non-lecturing about an issue that has gotten so polarized. And what she says still is that the most effective thing we can do, both as climate action and for our health, is to talk about it, to break that sort of wall of silence. It's not actually that complicated of a measure. It's just hard to do. And oftentimes the easiest or the most simple solutions are the hardest. And that's what we're going to be proposing here. What we have done around sort of parts of the country, and what's starting to happen more and more in different areas of the country, unfortunately, mostly in urban areas, and that's certainly a problem that we're wanting to think about, is sponsoring something called climate cafes. And I myself have problems with the word climate cafe. I think it assumes a whole lot of assumptions that I don't want to make. Very interested in thinking about other ways of framing what we talk about. But the gist of it ultimately is getting together with small groups of people in local areas in a completely non-judgmental space and setting the place for slowly beginning to talk about the range of feelings people have. And in those spaces, we absolutely emphasize that it's not political. We emphasize that there is no judgment. We emphasize that we are not demanding any kind of action afterwards, but just a place to sit and acknowledge and feel. And what we have found in these spaces, it's almost consistently that there's a period of silence when we talk about it at first, and then somebody opens up about a feeling of being ashamed for their children, or feeling scared for future legacies, or feeling guilty that they're even questioning whether they can do it any longer. And slowly those conversations open up to a sense of relief that they're not alone in having these questions, that they're not weird in having these questions, that it doesn't make them sick. It means that they're responding to what's happening in the world and trying to understand it. And it ends up creating almost a sense of laughter, that kind of space that opens up. It can start feeling very cold, sort of closed and suffocating. And by the end, it's open and laughing and people thinking about all sorts of different ways that they can help each other, mutual aid processes, and different ways of thinking about how to sort of support each other in different places. And what we have found is that the beauty of this model is that it does not require sort of mental health clinicians. Anybody can be trained in doing these things. You do not have to have a degree. It doesn't have to happen in a mental health office. Oftentimes, both those are stigmatizing, and there aren't that many in very rural areas or in farming communities. Again, Carrie, you were talking about the distances, how far people have to go. They can be done in places where people are already meeting, whether it's in libraries or barber shops or in insurance companies or wherever people are already congregating. I can imagine in the back of equipment stores, all of these different kinds of things where people could actually be having these kinds of meetings. They're very low cost. You don't have to pay very much. Sometimes it might be $10, $5 for access to be part of a cafe. They're very mobile. They can be online. They can be very easily reproduced and organized quickly. So they're not long-term commitments to one's mental health, which can set up all sorts of barriers for so many reasons for people actually seeking this kind of support. Within the Climate Psychology Alliance, we are offering trainings and support group for facilitators of climate cafes. And again, we're actually very, very, very open to hearing about ways in which we can adapt to this and ways we can learn how to make these feel both more approachable and located in areas where we think it would really be helpful. We are piloting a program to make this available regionally. Climate Psychology Alliance has a network of regional coordinators that is constantly growing. And we are using those coordinators to help us understand the language, the issues, the experiences within local communities so that these climate cafes don't land coming from somewhere out of outer space with a kind of politicized agenda, but instead are rooted in the experiences and feelings and the politics and the identities of the communities in which people are. So I would really love to sort of talk with people about what these look like, what the experience is, and any kind of questions or thoughts. I would be very open to hearing them. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. I love that you reiterated several times in there, talk about it. I mean, we just keep saying, just keep talking about it so it doesn't create such a stigma. And I think the pandemic kind of helped with that a little bit, that people did start talking about, you know, the mental health. I just hear about it a lot more than I used to. Jake in the chat says, how can we apply this window of tolerance to current political climate?
Do you want me to answer that now?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that that's a brilliant question. And I do think that the current political climate is, it's actually causing and creating such profound feelings of stress and tension, almost regardless of where one is on the political spectrum, a feeling of brittleness, a feeling that relationships are breaking down, a feeling that nuance and careful space to be able to just talk is really, really getting threatened. And people are getting highly, highly reactive very quickly. And I think that is in part also from the pandemic and the increasing bubbled nature of our communication, our news, that we can less and less we are less often engaging with people who disagree with us, less often seeing people who are different from us. And so we're much more prone to coming up with all sorts of stereotypes, all sorts of caricatures that do not actually play out when we meet people one-on-one. So the isolation that COVID helped create and the isolation in these communities is fertile ground for all sorts of misunderstandings, misinformation, and at the same time, the anxiety and the stress is still building. And so it's very vulnerable to all sorts of false solutions, exclusionary solutions, scapegoating solutions, all sorts of kinds of things, because people are feeling all these feelings, but they're not being given any sort of collaborative, collective way of thinking about it and how to solve them. So do I think that that's very much part of the political climate right now? Absolutely. Absolutely. And so as much as Climate Psychology Alliance is a 501c3, we are not in the business of endorsing candidates. That's not at all what we do. We are very much in favor of trying to create space, trying to create dialogue, trying to create bridges across different channels and sort of trying to make available the language of distress and connection that underlies so much of the anxiety that is happening out there. So I think it's very, very related.
I do too. Mitzi says, is there a template or anything written to support initiating this in one's community?
I'm hearing are you able to hear that? There's a lawnmower in my yard. I'm going to just close a window that's getting very loud. One moment. Hi. So we're in the process of creating a template and a manual for these. In some ways, the idea of a manual is a little bit misleading because it really isn't rocket science, actually. What it is, as Carrie said, is it's actually just breaking the silence and giving space for people to talk about it. But we do have models, we do have trainings offered through the Climate Psychology Alliance, and in the pilot program that we're beginning, that will include writing up sort of what are some of the best practices and also what are the places where we need adaptation and how do we How do we sort of learn from some of the mistakes? People didn't show up, it didn't feel right. And what do we gain by talking and sort of experimenting in different locations? So you are absolutely welcome to reach out and contact me, and I can certainly put you in contact with people who are working on those templates. And we're in the middle of research programs right now to try to identify what the best parts of those are, and what can be adapted and what needs to stay.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So I think Mallory wants to get a hold of you. She lives in Nebraska and would love to hold one in Aurora. So
Okay.
we'll have you put, oh, she's emailing you right now, she said.
Okay. Oops, that's US. Sorry. Thank you, Mallory. I look forward to hearing from you.
Yeah, there was, in the very beginning, there was a quote that I took a screenshot of that I'm 99% positive I'm stealing, but it was about the whole farming isn't Republican, it isn't Democrat, it's in all those things. And like that hit me because especially this year, of course, with the election, I'm so tired of hearing this. And then, you know, a lot of people in agriculture stick together, but even now we're going at each other with everything. And that like put everything in perspective. Like, remember, we're all still working in agriculture together, trying to help each other. And that's why I love this group so much is we're all working towards that same thing. We're not in competition, and it doesn't matter what our political views are. We're just all working towards the same goal.
Mm-hmm. I think it's also important that the way the media makes it seem as if this is an issue only among young people or the hyper woke people or snowflakes. There's so many different ways in which this is made to feel like it's not actually all over the place. And climate distress is not that different from the kinds of stresses that the farming community and agricultural community has had to deal with all the time in terms of weather variations and all of the other sort of contingencies about that kind of occupation. It's just amplifying and intensifying it, and it's making it harder to talk about it because it's become so politicized. And so our goal is to try to get beneath the political discourse and recognize actually we are all feeling the same thing in different places, in different locations, and to try to really dispel the myth that it's just an urban thing or just kind of an indulgent idea. Yes, exactly. It's remembering to start with what we can agree on and go from there. Absolutely.
Feel free to go ahead and unmute or post any more questions that you have for Rebecca in the chat. She did put her email in there, and we'll send like the web address and everything as well in the following email.
All right. And I would really welcome learning from all of you and emailing. And Erika, I really valued your presentation. I think there's so many different places where there's overlap. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's one of the big things we try to help everybody with is since we all are working towards the same our goal, let's collaborate. So I love it that you two are asking for, hey, give me your feedback, let's get together, because that invites everybody to collaborate with everybody.
Yeah. Someone's talking about Catherine Hayhoe. Yes.
I love it. I love it.
Loving these.
Okay, and Jan just put something in the chat for everyone who was interested in the window of tolerance.
Mm-hmm.
So go ahead and read that. She says it's a great tool. I'm going to look that up as well.
Daniel Siegel. He's a psychotherapist who works in attachment and trauma. And it's a term that he used, that he came up with.
Wonderful. Okay.
I miswrote my email, so the last two letters are US in case people.
Okay. And we'll send out both of our speakers, Erika and Rebecca, all their contact information, along with the link to rewatch this video that you can share with your colleagues. We're a little bit lower today on attendance because it's July 3rd. You know, people are taking off. But next month, I want to let you know we are having, it's called Heroes to Horses. It is a veterans program, and it's up, I think it's in Wyoming. I forgot already, but called Heroes to Horses. And then Kayla Anderson is coming back with Land Logic. We had her on, I think 2 years ago. It was a brand spanking new program, and they have just, I mean, done wonders with their program. So we're going to have her back. So, okay, I think that's it. I think we caught up. So thank you, everyone. Everyone have a wonderful July 4th and this weekend, and we will see you back in, oh my God, August, you guys, August. All right,
Thank you
see you,
so
everyone.
much. Thank you.